Hello everyone, today we talk about the history of Umbertine Rome for our series about the urbs, right? Also dedicated to sort of properly the promotion of the city of Rome, even in a historical but also touristical sense. Rome is a beautiful place to visit, but especially it's replete with an immensity of historical buildings, most of which, of course, people never hear of, and that tell the history, a much more complex history of the city, compared obviously to mostly the ancient, the Renaissance one that is also the most sort of grandiosely visible in the historical center proper, but that in this sense alone wouldn't render dignity to the city for how, as a historical product, but also for much of the actual interesting stories behind this, right? For example, I made a couple of years ago by now a video about Rome at the time of fascist empire, right? Between sort of the declaration of the so-called Italian Empire and the beginning of World War II. And then, of course, we'll make other videos about the previous period, the later one. The transformation of Rome into the capital of the unified Italian kingdom occurred during the reign of Umberto I, 1878-1900, constituting in this sense a deliberate state-orchestrated and frequently destructive rupture with the city's centuries-old identity as the center of papal temporal and spiritual authority, and as a predominantly Christian urban organism shaped by pilgrimage, jubilee cycles, and ecclesiastical dominance. If you're interested, I made a short series last year about the sort of jubilar tradition and the sacred basilicas of Rome. Now, when Rome became the national capital of Italy following the breach of Porta Pia on September the 20th, 1870, the event in which Italian troops under General Raffaele Cadorna bombarded and penetrated the ancient Aurelian walls near this gate, ending the Papal State's control over the city after more than a millennium and completing the Risorgimento's unification of Italy, at least in a broader symbolical sense, because that was historically understood to be fulfilled eventually during the First World War, and also with some sort of after the second in particular, but also during sort of the interwar period, some sort of unfulfillment. By the way, Raffaele Cadorna, who seized Rome at 59 years old in 1870, was the father of the more famous Luigi Cadorna, the commander-in-chief of the Italian army from 1914 to 1917. So you see also the agglutination of a broader sort of Italian sort of military tradition in a truly unitary sense. Well, the new regime in Rome confronted the urgent necessity to impose upon it a secular, unitary, patriotic, and emphatically laic character, one that would proclaim the birth of the so-called Third Rome, a concept consciously evoking the city's ancient imperial glory as the First Rome and the medieval pontifical era as the Second, while positioning the unified kingdom as a modern successor, embodying secular liberty and national unity. It's a very interesting perspective because, of course, it's a very modern, secular one if you want the past of the city. But first of all, there are lots of sort of symbols in today's Rome dating from there. We will see, including the same Victorian and the fact, the affirmation of the Statue of Victory. That's actually the entire point. It's also after Victor Emmanuel reign. But in general, the sense that the Statue of Victory, as it is on the Victorian, surpasses the sort of the Christian papal authority in the urban landscape is quite prepotently affirmed at this point in history, and that's why we also have, as I always point out at this point, to talk way more about 19th century history to understand the relation between lay states and the church, because it's a much more complicated story than you think. In fact, in the last video, we barely addressed the Lateran pacts that Mussolini signed with the city of the Vatican, And that's also something, in fact, that contemporary Italy to this day sticks to in terms of that relation, with very unique, in fact, relations between church and state. Now, the post-unification, at least as far as Rome was concerned, project unfolded across more than 2 decades through an extraordinarily aggressive and invasive program of monumental statuary, symbolic reappropriation of public space that had belonged to, again, the church. This is a temporal patrimonium sancti patri, the papal state. Systematic toponymic renaming. Mind that, right, when you walk around Rome. Large-scale hygienic sanitary demolitions as well, because as we'll see now, many quarters were historically sort of unhealthy, that weren't for example, even the defenses against floods on the River Tiber, these were created at this point. So, you can imagine it was actually very picturesque. There are many beautiful paintings. If anything, we will, throughout all Roman history, we will use them in all the other videos. I made something about the 18th century already. But there were lots of water mills in Rome, like in most sort of pre-industrial cities at large. Like, it was a very different phase. You can't see of it anymore, if not, again, in paintings, sort of printings, and etc. River regulation in this sense as well. Then you have bridge construction, too, more modern bridges, sewer reconstruction, in a dense calendar of royal ceremonial inaugurations that together physically remade the urban body, redefined its visual and ritual landscape, and sought to root the fragile legitimacy of the young kingdom in the eternal city's prestige, while systematically effacing much of its immediate pre-unification papal and medieval past amid chronic financial insufficiency, administrative polarization, speculative construction booms and busts, social dislocation, and recurring public health crisis. It's really a lot of stuff we will look at today, and essentially a successful one, because we will have to talk about Italian unification at some point, and its sort of actually clamorous success, considering the modest resources with which it was carried out, right? And this is often underrated, right? For some reason, I see on X people overly debate Italian history in ways that I truly don't get. I mean, there is an actual historiography. Read that, right? This is valid for any time and place. Like, why would people like to debate stuff with strangers with sort of incredibly short, limited in that sense, ex post about major historical dynamics? I remember I thought that I would never say such a thing in comparison, that Facebook history groups back in the day when they were still alive were much more interesting. There was much more of an actual debate about this all, considering the incredibly modest resources with which it was carried out, right? And this is often underrated, right? For some reason, I see on X people overly debate Italian history in ways that I truly don't get. I mean, there is an actual historiography. Read that, right? This is valid for any time and place. Like, why would people like to debate stuff with strangers with sort of incredibly short, limited in that sense, ex post about major historical dynamics? I remember I thought that I would never say such a thing in comparison, that Facebook history groups back in the day when they were still alive were much more interesting. There was much more of an actual debate about this all. The regime particularly employed monumental statuary as one of the most visible and ideologically potent tools for embedding the Risorgimento narrative directly into the city's topography and daily experience. Memorials and statues dedicated to patriots, martyrs, poets, soldiers, and thinkers of the national movement were erected in carefully selected strategic locations as to confront citizens constantly with exemplars of sacrifice, virtue, and devotion to the patria. This is very interesting because the Risorgimento narrative was in many ways historically flawed, right? It didn't make much sense for most of these figures, at least. Even in the past, obviously there was glaring anachronism just as much as, in the 19th century in general, that tendentially was, especially when you follow the nationalistic, at least, narratives, because you definitely can see in some of these figures an important sort of found national fundamental character, right, and context that even today is not fully recognized, but not quite in the direction that, particular at this point, the Italian government wanted to give, with a sort of relatively short-sighted awareness of the actual potential of Italian historiography had it been properly, and history obviously, had it been properly articulated, right? If anything, this is a very big topic, especially as a military historian. This thing interests me a lot because when you study the Italian Middle Ages, you realize that even up to this day, there isn't like a solid backbone. We often talk about this in the videos about the Italian communes, right? That there isn't a solid sort of riverbed for, in fact, a unitary narrative about the history of this or that power at the time. You can study mostly from structuralism the communal phenomenon in some more systematic and sometimes even abstract way, at least theoretical way. But the history properly of an Italian nation existed in medieval times and had some features that at this point, for example, were not really studied, right? The scholars of the time tended to even look at the Middle Ages as a moment, this was true also for many other Europeans, as a sort of stagnant time in the art of war, right? If you read even, I don't know, Del Brook, there is at least a sort of discounted way of medieval warfare. On the other hand, you have this contemporary quote-unquote heroes that very often were even, frankly, terrorists by traditional standards, and in fact radical ideologists to some degree, for not talking about the revaluation. This was done also, and especially in the Protestant world, of certain heretical figures that were seen all of a sudden as heroes against the terrible Catholic Church, right? And even in this sort of very fundamentally lay, in any case post-traditional, because again, the Kingdom of Italy, the Holy Roman Empire were abolished in the 19th century, as you know, with Napoleon. It wasn't that far away in time, interestingly enough. But indeed, the ecclesiastical resistance, it wouldn't be settled ideologically, politically, until, again, fascism, that reopened the papacy to the world to a very important degree, is the one of even aversion toward religion, which at the time was, say, fruit of a post-traditional ideology that we still sort of live in. So that the person who says was modern and liberal, whatever, that hates Christianity, like, it's not able to connect the most obvious dots that today instead historiography prepotently asserts everywhere that by far Catholic civilization was the leading pivot, right, around probably the development of Western civilization in the Middle Ages, and even beyond, for most of the modern age as well, right? The surpassing of Protestant Europe over Catholic one, something extremely recent. We're talking the end of the 19th century. The end of the 19th century. Even today is something like, in terms, for example, of GDP per capita, like something like 6%. It's been bridged, and it's keeping to change in this sense. So it's quite fascinating to see all these mechanisms. In Trastevere, for example, you had a monument raised to Giuditta Tavani Arquati, the Republican seamstress and patriot who, along with her husband and infant son, was executed by papal forces in 1867. So it was quite recent history, admittedly, during a failed uprising against papal rule in Rome, becoming a symbol of anti-clerical resistance and female emancipation in the nationalist cause. Which, again, in and of itself, you understand there is something wrong about it. Like, this was, we will talk about, naturally, that time of Roman history immediately before Umbert's reign. But the sense, of course, is that these had been not quite edifying figures. I presume that even this woman today in contemporary Italy is basically unknown. Like, nobody nobody really remembers her to begin with. On the Campidoglio, you have instead very famous, very sort of out there at the bottom of the Aracelli, the statue honoring Cola di Rienzi. This was a, as you know, 14th century notary and popular leader who briefly established a republican government in Rome in 1347. We talked about him, I think, in one of Schwerpunkt's early videos. We also talk about him again in the one about Charles IV of Luxembourg, because Rienzi was that kind of famous figure. And it's very interesting, by the way, that 19th century German, Italian opera composers would exchange each other's sort of historical figures in this way. Rienzi, famously enough, William Tell from the other. So that's a very interesting time for looking at, even at the European scale, how these figures were actually seen. And Rienzi had historically advocated for Italian unity and opposed noble and papal dominance at the time, naturally in ways that were not really what you would imagine by 19th century nationalist standards or statal standards. Like the whole story was later romanticized as a medieval precursor to the Risorgimento's ideals of popular sovereignty and anti-papal resistance. There was some classical legacy in medieval Italy. It was deeply felt by the Roman people. This is often the more you study medieval Italy, the more you realize how high that awareness was. Also, this is interesting considering what we discussed recently about the idea of Romanity in the Byzantine world, because it's not even just about denying the Romanity of the Western Empire. For them, it's literally ignoring that there was an Italian centrality in the imperial Catholic traditional medieval civilization. This in turn is deeply underrated, if not properly removed, because of 19th century ideologies of different peoples across the West, due to, again, this nationalistic favoritisms and you would be surprised by how rigged our historical understanding of the past is still there because of the 19th century in many ways. It's still, of course, also reevaluated these entire times. Definitely Rienzi was a very interesting figure. While in prison in Prague, for example, he properly Latinized in a higher humanistic sense the Bohemian court. He was really an interesting political figure, and he, if anything, managed to alienate some parts of the nobility in still what was an effort of its emancipation together with the people from the papacy. But it was a very delicate balance, so it's not like the people rising against papal oppression. That's not what would work, also because the Pope was not even in Rome at the time. As you know, and we'll talk more about the Avignon papacy, which I realized we made really very few content on. On the Pincio, the Cairoli brothers were commemorated for their heroic familial martyrdom, as several of the Pavia-born siblings died or were wounded fighting for Italian unification. These were all Lombards that had come to fight also in Rome, and notably in the same 1867 campaign we were hinting at. Near San Silvestro in Via del Tritone, Pietro Metastasio represented the celebrated 18th century Roman poet and librettist whose operas, dramatic works epitomize the cultural heights of Italian literature. So you have all these statues scattered across Rome at that point. In Campo de' Fiori, you have also very famously still the statue of Giordano Bruno, unveiled in 1889 as a defiant emblem of free thought and scientific inquiry. The philosopher burned at the stake by the Inquisition in the very square where the statue, in fact, was arisen in 1600 for heresy, and whose monument, erected by Freemasons, by the way, served as a bold anti-clerical statement at the same time. Now, of course, Bruno's history is quite fascinating. We should make a video about him. But, if you start going off rail with sort of, heretical ideologies, you can't expect, after having initially recanted, by the way, to simply, to insist and get away with that, especially in 1600. And again, in 1600, the Inquisition was a much better tribunal than basically any other lay one existing in Europe. And this is what historiography tells us in terms of fair justice, properly trial instruction, actual witnesses, like the entire procedural form, guarantees of rights, etc. So you see, it's annoying. It's sort of disturbing to look at this in the 21st century, looking at the 90s. It's not that far away, especially in the extremities of the same. But let's say, and realize how much history was basically undigested in this public political statement, right, in memory. On the heights of the Gianicolo, you have the same Giuseppe Garibaldi, enthroned in 1895 as the iconic military leader of the Risorgimento, the hero of the two worlds. It's a lot of interesting military history as far as is concerned. He had commanded defenses of the Roman Republic in 1849 during the uprisings of that biennium, and was a question statue, in fact, still overlooks the city he helped liberate from papal control, at least back then. In front of the Termini station, the monument to the 500 fallen at Dogali was solemnly inaugurated on December the 21st, 1887, in the presence of the royal couple, numerous parliamentarians, and Mayor Leopoldo Torlonia. That is also, one of sort of the interesting figures in certain specific architectonic re-embellishment, especially of some areas outside of what historically would. Some quarters were being built in this, as we'll see now, expansion of the city, prompting the, in fact, immediate renaming of the square to Piazza del Cinquecento and the placement of a matching commemorative plaque on the Palazzo Senatorio honoring the Italian soldiers massacred in the 1887 Battle of Dogali in Eritrea during Italy's early colonial efforts in East Africa, using an ancient Egyptian obelisk rediscovered in Rome as its centerpiece to symbolize national sacrifice. And historically also a reminder of the Italian rule, right, back in Roman times over North Africa, at least. We will talk about these colonial enterprises because, again, they're also very interesting and somehow politically, historically, culturally underrated. Now, beside the Ministry of Finance on Via 20 Settembre, Quintino Sella was unveiled in 1893. This was a more recent statement. Economist and key Risorgimento figure anyway, who advocated for Rome's occupation in 1870 and served as finance minister. In Piazza San Pantaleo, immediately adjacent to Palazzo Braschi, then serving as a seat of the presidency of the council and the Ministry of the Interior, Marco Minghetti was inaugurated on September 24, 1896, amid the 25th anniversary celebrations of Rome's liberation, with his statue commemorating the moderate liberal politician and twice prime minister who helped guide Italy through unification. Near San Giovanni dei Fiorentini, Terenzo Mamiani received his statue, honoring the philosopher, writer, and patriot who fought in the Risorgimento and held ministerial roles in the new kingdom. These works were never isolated aesthetic gestures. They formed an intentional gallery of heroes of the past, more or less recent, designed explicitly to incite citizens to the most dignified thoughts concerning the patria, the fatherland. Right? They were reinforced by a multitude of commemorative plaques affixed to buildings across the rioni of Rome, and above all by the systematic renaming of streets after key dates, battles, and personalities of the Risorgimento. The saying 20 Settembre is about the breach of Porta Pia. And so this was a truly pervasive toponymic campaign that transformed every daily journey through the city into an involuntary pedagogical encounter with the narrative of national unification, and that embedded the values of the new state in the very nomenclature of urban space. And notice that, because, of course, like wherever you travel, you look at the street signs and so on, And especially the more important ones are usually, of course, attributed more famous names. It's very interesting to tour around the center of Rome, looking at various streets. Well, many also maintain actually the original name of, especially in the medieval part of Rome, but in general, like also in the still in the city center, but in the outer parts, and also still within the Aurelian walls. There are so many of these, especially of that era, because that's the part around this, the deeper historical center that was rampantly developed at the time, that was Christ baptized to begin with, as that expansion took place. Central to this emerging secular cult of the Patria stood the figure of Victor Emmanuel II, elevated to the status of the reunifier and Pater Patria, whose memory was cultivated with an intensity that bordered on quasi-religious veneration. Always remember this about 19th century national ideologies, that they were meant to supplant fundamentally religious ones. This was an old historical process also of secularization, modernization, but the idea, if you study, I don't know, what ministers of education for more or less all across Europe said without any problem at the time, because that was their mandate and specific purpose. As you see, many of them had participated also to these movements of national unification. Germany and Italy were unified only 10 years apart, to make an example. Then basically you had to simply indoctrinate people, say in the few at the lower levels of now gradually expanding mass education, truly to just know those few things, like that story, that those anecdotes that revolve around the myth of the fatherland, and nothing else. Literally no perspective, no deeper appreciation for your country's history, even in any deeper sense. It's just, okay, we have to basically create people who are enough to be, say, that are enough ideological to go fight for their country if in need, as mass warfare requires, again, this incentive from, in fact, a moral standpoint that we can't create through truly a deep ideological indoctrination. Again, this also makes sense because that's more or less what all countries were doing at the time. But it will remain the basis for what you may have actually still been taught yourself in school. And so that is not particularly sort of deep or more expanded than, of course, like things were very different if you ask your parents or whatever. And I'm talking specifically for Europe because I know that probably in the United States things are even more sort of ahead for different reasons. Yet, again, what many anecdotes, cliches, concepts that people share today in Europe and in the various countries, respective countries, fundamentally derive from this ancient history. All right. Victor Emmanuel's tomb in the Pantheon, by the way, the ancient temple converted into a national mausoleum, as you know, became the focal point of repeated pilgrimages by veterans of the independence wars, interestingly enough, who established permanent honor guards there and thereby displaced traditional Christian jubilees, feast days, and processions with ceremonies of civic devotion that redirected sacral emotions from the church toward the state and its founding monarch. Which is, if you think about it, again, pretty weird, because these things were still kind of integrated. But remember, the church at this point had much smaller power than it had before in the city. And so these issues, these ambiguities, were quite even at this point. And the lay narrative was enforced overall in public display and political institutions. Now, the spontaneous popular practice of abbreviating the newly created Via Vittorio Emanuele, laid out in the Castro Pretorio Rione and formally inaugurated as Piazza Vittorio Emanuele II on June the 19th, 1882, to the simple affectionate diminutive Vittorio, testified to a widespread, almost familial attachment among ordinary Romans by that point to the memory of the unifying king. This grassroots sentiment found its most ambitious architectural expression in the project for a national monument to Victor Emmanuel II, whose conception was formalized as early as 1879, and whose foundation stone Umberto I laid in person on March the 22nd, 1885, in Piazza Venezia in a ceremony attended by the entire royal family and foreign diplomatic representatives. The resulting Vittoriano, later officially designated the Altare della Patria, demanded sweeping expropriations and demolitions carried out principally between 1885 and 1888. The entire northern and eastern flanks of the Capitoline Hill were in fact cleared of their intricate medieval and Renaissance quarters, including narrow, winding alleys, densely packed residential blocks, convents, workshops, and structures clustered immediately around Santa Maria in Araceli that had for centuries framed the ceremonial approaches to the hill. So this was actually terrible, as most of what actually happened all across Europe during this point in terms of urbanistic redrawing for different purposes. Admittedly, some of the older, think about what happened to Paris, what will happen to many other capitals. In the entire quarters were dismantled. Some were very old. Again, they were truly decadent and in ruin, and you gotta understand, of course, like that the prestige of a country was measured at the time also through this, but in many ways there was also literally a strategic purpose. You needed great long alleys because ideally, if a riot happened, you could simply place a cannon at the bottom of the path and simply shooting over everybody. And this happened in times of insurrections, of sort of greater, at this point, like major sort of revolutionary movements in Europe were over, but still you needed mobility for control. There were still people who actually were nostalgic of the papal regime, telling the truth. Nothing in particular actually anywhere, like all the former papal states, but in general, like the greatness of the papacy, the spiritual hegemony, while contested, while sort of wounded and injured, and so on, was still there. And of course, to many of, for example, the Roman noble families that had lived throughout the whole thing, there were sort of liberal thoughts, etc. But there was still a sense of deference, of respect, and sort of much of what happened in those decades was felt more harshly than the glorifying narrative that eventually was given out of this. Modernization had to happen in terms of just like fixing up the city, giving it probably a different functionality, right? But also much was destroyed of a Rome that, in the sense, that doesn't quite exist anymore in certain quarters, in certain parts. Like you can't find, for example, few of medieval Rome. But, admittedly, like during the Renaissance, much of that had already disappeared. But still, Europe looked very differently in the 19th century, also from a urbanistic standpoint. Now, the sheer duration of the construction cantier for the Vittoriano, with major sculptural elements still incomplete well into the 20th century, converted the historic center into a permanent construction site where the incessant noise of the pickaxe accompanied the constant arrival of entrepreneurs hungry for state contracts and the continuous influx of migrant laborers from the overpopulated rural regions of Lazio, Umbria, and the Marches in central Italy and beyond, all drawn by the promise of wages amid widespread demographic pressure and agrarian crisis at the same time. Municipal administration labored under crushing and chronic constraints that severely hampered the realization of the capital's transformation. The Commune of Rome possessed wholly insufficient autonomous revenues to finance the enormous infrastructure demands of a modern national capital. Right. At the same time, and this is true in many ways. I mean, it's not just like Rome was essentially a small capital for at least the major Western power standards, but in particular, the costs, just like today, telling the truth, given the very specific nature of the city, are in fact hyperinflated by the fact that wherever you dig, you're going to find something new. It's just like the new subway station was inaugurated, I think, last year, at the end of last year, like integrates literally pieces of what, but this is normal, like what was found underneath. All right. And imagine, again, having to deal with this. Even what is interesting from a historical perspective is sort of the people that they employed, even to calculate at some point what could be essentially destroyed, what could be preserved, and so on. In any case, it cost a lot. These were massive works, and they actually show like the commitment of the Italian kingdom in this great renovation and transformation. At the same time, the city council remained structurally and bitterly divided between a conservative bloc of Catholic imprint, we were referring to them before, often aligned with clerical interests and nostalgic for the papal regime, there is no doubt, and instead a progressive, anti-clerical, frequently Republican-leaning current that pushed for rapid laicization and modernization. We understand that there was a lot at stake, even just in terms of actual churches' patrimony. Some of it unfortunately went destroyed with care. Again, this was not as savage as sort of utter destruction in general, but whatever you do in Rome, and it is going to, in any case, make you lose something very precious. These two contrasting souls, so to say, in Rome, produce chronic administrative paralysis, endless delays in approving and executing essential public works, and bitter polemics that retarded every major initiative. So a bit of, also historical and political reasons for Italian bureaucratic inefficiency. Central government under Agostino de Pretis in successive transformismo cabinets frequently exhibited what contemporary observers such as Armando Ravaglioli described as an esoso atteggiamento, an exorbitant, grasping posture, insisting on projects that served national prestige and military administrative needs while demanding supine obedience from the municipality and offering only grudging conditional financial aid. We'll talk also about these figures at some point in the series that I grafted into the lottery/cycle, finally about contemporary history, not just military one from the year. Only after years of tense, difficult negotiations, during which the municipality repeatedly protested its penury and the government resisted substantial concessions, and thanks in part to the advocacy of influential figures such as, for example, the aforementioned Quintino Sedla, who felt a personal and political debt toward Rome, interestingly enough, did the 1881 law finally guarantee considerable annual state contributions to the capital's budget, together with extraordinary special allocations specifically earmarked for the construction of the Vittoriana. This is quite interesting because you're not punishing your capital, right? There was a true, strong Italian attachment and providential understanding about Rome being the capital of a unified Italy. There had been other competitors as far as Turin, Milan, Florence. Some had actually been capital before Rome because Italian unification de facto had happened in 1861. So it had been probably even probably a push for having Rome as the capital of Italy. As you know, that also was posticipated over other reconquests in the northeast. It's only the Franco-Prussian War that basically allows the Italians to attack what was left of the papal states, essentially around Rome, had been garrisoned by the French Zouaves, and that they were recalled to France. While, for example, the same Garibaldi fought for the French against the Germans, and also scoring some victories, as a matter of fact, in that very war. So it's complicated and it's interesting. It's opportunistic. We've seen part of this in the video about Franz Joseph, the military history of the last great, at least Habsburgic ruler. And so it's all the interesting story because it shows how definitely the Risorgimento had immediately and unavoidably spotted as Rome as the sole possible center of united Italy. It had become like probably the battle cry of many Italian patriots that died in the fighting. Now, the arrival of the funds to Rome immediately unleashed, by the way, a speculative construction frenzy. Building contractors multiplied, land values in the center and in emerging peripheries soared in anticipation of state-backed projects, and labor migration intensified dramatically, drawing thousands of workers from regions suffering acute overpopulation, rural distress, as we were saying before, into the swelling cantier economy of the capital. No single undertaking more dramatically embodied the intersection of hygienic urgency, national symbolism, physical violence against the historic fabric, and long-term urban reconfiguration than the comprehensive regulation of the Tiber, as we were saying before. For centuries, in fact, and notoriously enough, the river had functioned as both lifeline and perennial threat. Its recurrent floods inundated the low-lying rioni of Regola, Trastevere, and the Ghetto, while the stagnant marshes, floating mills, and miasmatic exhalations rising from its unregulated course were persistently blamed for the endemic scourge of malaria that afflicted the population. Right? Preliminary embankment, channelization, and regularization works had commenced in 1877, but they acquired decisive scale, speed, and radicality only after the 1881 financing law provided the necessary state funds, and especially after the devastating cholera epidemic of 1884, originating in Naples and spreading rapidly through the poorest, most densely inhabited quarters adjacent to the river, which killed hundreds and exposed the lethal inadequacy of the existing riparian and sanitary arrangements. The official response was sweeping and uncompromising. The riverbed was regularized to a mathematically constant and uniform width designed to eliminate dangerous constrictions and accelerate flow. Every obstruction, floating mills, private docks, calate, sand accumulations, and other riparian encumbrances was systematically removed. Upstream collectors were constructed to intercept and divert surface runoff and prevent stagnation in the lower reaches. The most insalubrious and overcrowded zones underwent aggressive demolition, justified explicitly as both immediate epidemic control and essential precondition for any authentic urban renewal. Right? So this also sort of kind of disfigured Rome historically, but it was actually a masterpiece also of the time's engineering, and very much needed sort of step further, because otherwise, Rome would have kept being routinely flooded, if anything. That was the greater problem, aside from illnesses, because of sort of precarious sort of population density and sort of living conditions along the river banks. Now, in Regola, and above all in the Ghetto, the riverside blocks were raised between 1885 and 1891. The operation was presented not merely as a sanitary necessity, but again, an indispensable moral and physical regeneration of quarters long stigmatized as sources of disease, overcrowding, and backwardness. Among the most bitterly lamented losses were the Porto di Ripetta, however, the elegant 18th century river port immortalizing countless vedute by Piranesi, Vasi, and others, as well as the Teatro Apollo at Tordinona, together with long continuous fronts of noble palazzi facades, medieval towers, and other historic riverside constructions that had for centuries defined the city's intimate, picturesque, and functional relationship with the water. To compensate for the destruction of traditional crossing points and to integrate the new high embankments and Lungotevere Promenade functionally into the urban network, a sequence of modern iron and stone bridges was erected in rapid succession. Ponte Garibaldi in 1888, Ponte Palatino in 1890, Ponte Margherita in 1891. Inaugurated in the presence of the sovereigns amid torrential rain and thunderstorms that dramatically tested the new structure, interestingly enough. And Ponte Umberto I in 1895. And so we can still see them in Rome. Ponte Sisto was modernized with widened sidewalks carried on iron corbels and fitted with cast iron parapets. Ponte Sant'Angelo received 2 additional arches to connect its Berninian core to the raised embankment levels. The provisional Ripetta footbridge, which had replaced the ancient ferry service, was in turn superseded by the more permanent Ponte Cavour in 1901. The hydraulic and embankment operations along the Tiber demanded as an inseparable corollary the complete reconstruction and extension of the urban sewerage network. Countless streets in the Rioni bordering the river possessed no underground drainage infrastructure whatsoever. Household and street effluents ran in open gutters and rigagnoli directly into the Tiber, perpetuating cycles of contamination and reinforcing the urgent necessity for comprehensive modernization. The 1884 cholera emergency, as we've seen, had forced immediate emergency interventions. Contaminated wells in the densest and poorest lower districts were sealed. A temporary lazaretto was established on the Aventino at Santa Sabina to isolate cases, and rigorous disinfection campaigns were carried out across the affected zones. The demolition of the ghetto, far from being a merely reactive sanitary measure, was explicitly framed in official discourse as the essential precondition for any serious attempt at modernizing the quarter's living conditions, improving circulation, eradicating sources of miasma, and inserting hygienic, rationally planned residential and connective elements into the urban fabric. Now, throughout the entire span of Umberto I's reign, the monarchy, and particularly the figures of the king and his wife in person, pursued an active, sustained policy of ceremonial visibility and public ritual designed to embed the dynasty symbolically with the transformed city and to project an image of continuity, accessibility, and national legitimacy, bridging the Risorgimento past and the monarchical present. Umberto and Margherita had first taken up residence in Rome in January 1871, themselves as crown prince at the time and princess to represent the dynasty in the newly conquered capital. After Victor Emmanuel II's sudden death on January 9, 1878 at the Quirinale at 2:30 p.m., attended by his children but barred from the bedside by ministerial decision, was his morganatic wife, Rosa Vercellana. There is a story behind her, but let's not digress into it. We will see it better in another video. Umberto chose to entomb his father in the Pantheon, as we were saying, rather than return the body to Turin, where the Savoy house had been previously ruling, and also sort of leading the same Italian unification, thereby fixing, with this move, the Savoy mausoleum as well, definitively in the national capital, and deliberately breaking with subalpine dynastic numbering by assuming the title Umberto I, Umberto I, to signify an Italian rather than merely Piedmontese identity. This was not 100% true because Victor Emmanuel II, in fact, the second of Italy, right? He had not abandoned the previous Piedmontese, Sardinian numeration. In fact, also, as you know, Umberto's son would be Victor Emmanuel III, so it actually continued it as far as the Victor Emmanuels, because at least there had been a first Victor Emmanuel II of Italy that was in turn just not abandoned, and that is not very, not necessarily auspicious, that in any case the monarchy didn't last too long. That's sort of in the bigger picture in Italian history, but it sort of highlights also the complexity of what had been probably the Italian unification process in a also identitary sense. Again, now we absolutely have to make a video about the Italian unification, telling the truth. Now, the reign of Umberto was punctuated by an extraordinarily dense calendar of public inaugurations, military reviews, bridge openings, as we've seen, artistic and agricultural expositions, gymnastic and tirassegno competitions, marksman shooting, and monument unveilings tied to anniversaries of unification and Risorgimento events. Among the most prominent were the inauguration of the Palazzo delle Esposizioni, so the exhibits, the palace, on January 21st, 1883, hosting the first international art exhibition organized by the Società degli Amatori e Cultori di Belle Arti, which led to significant state acquisitions for the emerging Galleria Nazionale, as a matter of fact. The solemn unveiling of the Cinquecento Caduti di Dogoli monument, as we've seen before, on December 21st, 1887, the opening of the first national shooting range at Tor di Quinto in 1890, with the king himself firing the inaugural round, and the grand silver wedding anniversary celebrations of 1893 that brought Wilhelm II of Germany and numerous foreign royal representatives to Rome for military parades of 20,000 troops at Prati di Castello historical equestrian tournaments in Villa Borghese. Just think about that. And lavish garden parties at the Quirinale. That had been historically also the seat of papal power at a point in the papal state's history. So that's also very symbolic in terms of the replacement, probably ecclesiastical lay rule. Also, the international connections are interesting. These spectacles, frequently illuminated by Bengala flares dramatically lightening the Foro Romano and the Colosseum, accompanied by municipal bands performing the Marcia Reale, the Royal March, punctuated by mass releases of doves, or elaborate fireworks girandole mounted on Castel Sant'Angelo for feasts of the Statuto, and concluded with, because that was the Albertine one, concluded with public addresses, in fact, emphasizing loyalty to this, essentially the foundational constitution issued before the Italian unification in Piedmont by Charles Albert of Sardinia. So to sacralize the national monarchy in this way, in the popular imagination, even as the regime grappled with the transformismo governmental instability, the late 1880s building speculation bubble, in its subsequent collapse, mounting social discontent in the face of economic crisis, colonial disaster at Adwa in March 1896, a very interesting battle, and 3 successive direct attempts on the king's life. You know how it ended, by the way. You have Giovanni Passanante's knife attack in Naples on November 17, 1878, during a national tour. Pietro Charito's failed assault near the Capannelle Hippodrome on the Via Appia on April the 22nd, 1897, while Umberto was en route, by the way, to races commemorating the wedding anniversary. And finally, Gaetano Brescia's fatal revolver shots at Monza in northern Italy on July the 29th, 1900, where Umberto was killed, famously enough. It's interesting because some of these festivals that we were listing had historically been performed in Rome already. There is all a Roman tradition. We will see it better in other videos. And so the fireworks, for example, at Castel Sant'Angelo, those were really historic in Roman history. And at this point, they were associated with essentially a Risorgimento ideology, as we were noticing. Yet these very ceremonies, often drawing enormous crowds that filled piazzas and lined the Corso, accompanied by spontaneous acclamations, band music, and displays of national flags, sustained the monarchy's visibility, reinforced its role as guarantor of unity, and contributed powerfully to the gradual sacralization of national institutions within the rapidly evolving urban landscape of the capital. So by the close of the 19th century and the end of Umberto I's reign, Rome had been physically, symbolically, and ideologically reforged into something fundamentally new. A national capital of the Italian kingdom whose historic center had been radically gutted to make space for patriotic monuments, widened arteries, and modern administrative buildings, whose intimate, picturesque, and centuries-old relationship with the Tiber had been severed by high embankments erected in the name of flood prevention, malaria eradication, public health. Garibaldi historically had been a great proponent of that for that. And this was an old thing. I mean, Julius Caesar back in the day wanted to deviate the course of the Tiber. A priori, obviously, and he hadn't been assassinated, probably would have even happened. So it's very interesting. Here again, we will talk more and better about the various expansion of the city in another video. But I mean, this was really a moment of great growth. If anything, we noticed that this initial monumental and probably royal settlement, because again, Victor Emmanuel II hadn't quite been too much connected with Rome. So Umberto I was really, right, the first true king residing in Rome and making it probably a capital, a royal capital. Whose symbolic landscape had been colonized now by secular statuary, risorgimento toponymy, and civic rituals that supplanted papal memory and ecclesiastical dominance in the public sphere, and whose infrastructure, bridges, sewers, embankments, exposition halls, had been overhauled under the twin imperatives of hygiene, efficient circulation, and assertive national dignity. The cumulative effect was the creation of the city that you can recognize today, essentially with the streets, bridges, squares, Lungotevere promenades, and visual horizons now proclaimed, often stridently and controversially, the triumph of unification and the definitive consolidation of the young kingdom's capital in its historic heart. And this was just the beginning, if anything, of a true urban expansion. The center had been properly transformed in ways that came at an immense and immediately visible cost, by the way. The irreplaceable erasure of vast swathes of medieval and Renaissance urban tissue, the displacement of thousands of residents from demolished quarters, profound social dislocation in the face of rapid immigration and speculative instability, severe economic fragility following the building crisis that peaked toward the end of the 1880s, persistent administrative and political tensions between the old papal aristocracy and the new national bourgeoisie. Also a lingering perception of incompleteness and disruption amid unfinished monuments, abandoned speculative lots, unresolved inhabiting problems in the peripheral zones, and the still unhealed rift between the memory of papal Rome and the imposed reality of the Roma Umbertina that continued to mark the transformed and often visibly scarred urban reality of the capital well into the 20th century. In all of this, a little note about sort of in the midst of this sweeping physical and symbolic remaking of the urbs, the early 1880s, the emergence of a distinctive popular figure who embodied the tensions, disillusionments, and undercurrents of this content that accompanied the transition to capital status. We're talking Francesco Coccapiller. He was born in Rome in 1831 to Giuseppe, that was, however, actually Swiss in origin, hence the Coccapiller, that is a foreign name. The father was employed at a salt and tobacco shop. The mother was Luigia Apolloni. Francesco had been educated at local schools before enlisting at 16 in the Papal Dragoons, interestingly. So this is all before the unification, and we'll see now how it comes up in Umbertine's Rome. He, in fact, fought as a volunteer in the First War of Independence in 1848, when the Pope actually sent troops to fight the Habsburgs, interestingly enough. And that was really strange and unique, because later also things were very different, but we should study what happened in 1848, because it was really a sort of interesting time. There were many different options still open on the table as far as Italy's unification mechanism, including contemplating, according to some at least, the probably unfeasible possibility of a confederation at the end of which the Pope could exist, right? So this guy was fighting essentially in the papal army, and also with his Swiss legacy, and he defended, however, so the Roman Republic in 1849, so meaning that by then, like with the uprising in Rome, he sided with the liberals in any case. So he had this, what the Pope did in 1848 was kind of liberal, so that's why he had a line and listened. And he fought at Porta San Pancrazio against the French, and at Velletri and Palestrina against the Neapolitans. That's all the history of, again, how the Roman Republic was eventually repressed, and so by more reactionary powers at the time. For this reason, when things went worse, Francesco fled to Piedmont after the papal restoration, becoming an instructor at the Pinerolo and later Vercelli cavalry schools. These were important Savoy military institutions that had also historically covered the country in glory in the previous wars of the 18th and the 19th century. He rejoined Garibaldi in Sicily in 1860. So again, he was essentially one of those that went together with Garibaldi in the expedition that essentially took over southern Italy from the Bourbon dynasty, fought again with him in 1866 near Lake Garda. This is during the so-called, at least according from the Italian side, the Third War of Independence. This was the war when Italy and Prussia were allied against what will become, as a consequence of the defeat in this war of the Austrians, regardless of the Italian disasters, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Francesco was wounded at Lake Garda, by the way. Also, he participated in the Mentana campaign in 1867. These are all, again, episodes of the Italian Risorgimento that there he was in a minor logistical role overseeing horses, but it was an important clash also for taking Rome that Garibaldi took under amidst major tensions in a broader political sense, also with Piedmont and against the Papal States. So there is quite a revolutionary curriculum for Francesco, but also some chevrons earned in at least interesting military expeditions of the Risorgimento. And after the breach of Porta Pia in 1870, he had returned to Rome among the first exiles, engaging in local electoral committees in the Rione Monti and clashing bitterly with rivals such as Napoleone Parboni. For nearly 12 years, he lived an itinerant existence abroad, in England and France, attempting various trades, including an unsuccessful invention of an automatic carriage brake. In June 1882, Ricciotti Garibaldi, that was the son of Giuseppe Garibaldi, the hero of the Italian unification, recalled him to Rome to bolster the democratic left's fight against radical and republican circles in the lead-up to the October elections. Coca-Pillar first contributed to L'Eco dell'Operaio, which was naturally a leftist press, with scandalous anti-party articles that boosted circulation but drew threats and intimidation on him, forcing the paper's closure. Right, and people were, even in the liberal circles at the time, much less liberal, of course, than we tend today. He then founded his own newspaper, Ezio II, or Il Carro di Checco, in early July 1882, with Ricciotti's backing in this, because naturally the Garibaldines historically had been a bit more red in nature. The paper, written in rough but vivid language, launched a moralistic crusade against corruption, what Coca-Pillar called enemies and traitors of the patria, of the fatherland, and figures he accused often without proof of fraud, imposture, and betrayal, targeting especially Catholics and Republicans such as Napoleone Parboni, who said before his old rival, Alberto Mario, Felice Cavallotti, and Adriano Lemmi. His style that was sgrammaticato, which is a way to say basically didn't have much of a scholarly linguistically speaking, yet effective. Also because, as you know, Rome has at least had very much alive, a proper dialect, a proper language on its own. When we talk about Italian dialects today, we're not looking, first of all, at something particularly different from the ones of any other country, but people like to stress somehow the lack of Italian unity in a broader sense. But most of what we refer to today is some sort of accent, right? But these were fully fledged languages, meaning that they weren't actually different. I mean, the Roman is an offshoot of Tuscan. It's actually one of the most straightforwardly recognizable, after, in fact, Florentine, proper Italian dialects, because, as you know, Italian is modeled on Florentine, right, on the language of Dante, of Petrarch, of Boccaccio, and so on. But there was, of course, in the spirit of old Rome, this very heavy, rough language, right, of cocky attitude that allegedly also stems from the ancient Roman centurion's kind of arrogance and sort of entitlement. And so this guy was essentially a leftist, a revolutionary. He liked to provoke people around. He was anti-Catholic, so you see that he was riding the wave of these and receiving support from probably the revolutionaries. Those had been more radical from Saint Garibaldi's offspring, right? And there is in his writing this dream of the third Rome that we're referencing to before, giving way to daily miseries, speculation, widening gaps between a rich bourgeoisie and the popolo minuto, basically the fourth estate. So he was criticizing that providential vision of general development, and of course, as a radical leftist, he didn't like the fact, of course, there was a new order, a regime, a monarchy, and whatever. Because again, the Saint Garibaldines had been sort of strategically used by the Savoy house, but very much they were ideological radicals who were a bit sort of ennobled along the way, especially as they were gentrified in the process of parliamentary establishment and everything. But you have these popular voices in Rome that are very unique. Again, this guy who descends from, the Swiss legacy in Rome that has fought in the papal army and then against. This is a very characteristic figure. Coccapillar's attacks drew suings, threats, and violence. This was really an agitator, a pretty insufferable individual. In August 10th, 1882, the Republican butcher Angelo Tognetti, relative of the executed Tognetti of 1868, if anything we can look at, shot at him in an osteria. But Coccapillar, quicker on the draw, wounded Tognetti seriously and was imprisoned for excess of legitimate defense in the Carcere Nuove of Via Giulia. While incarcerated, he ran for parliament, interestingly enough, in the first Collegio di Roma on a list including Ricciotti Garibaldi and Luigi Pianciani. And on October the 29th, 1882, he was elected even, with a large majority amid torch-lit popular processions that escorted him from prison to Trastevere, where he addressed crowds from a window in Via Luciano Manara, promising to fight all the, quote, farabutti imbroglioni le tasse. Right, so basically all the scammers or the criminals and taxes. So it's a leftistic populist and basically a criminal himself, like a forger, a defamer, a populist, and so on. And for a year, he held court from the balcony of his home in this strange tradition in Via dei Greci as self-styled tribune, drawing enthusiastic crowds of coccapilleristi, as they were called, who formed a guard of honor and physically attacked hecklers. It was just like literally the tribunes, right? And with the fasces, so these were bands of tags of bodyguards, essentially, that escorted him across the streets. And as we've seen, he had lots of enemies. He had already been shot, and he had received much threat and so on. It was this weird, again, republicanistic imitation in his ways. You see how much like the myth of Rome resonated, especially like after French Revolution in the leftistic circles, the idea of, again, simply copying an alleged sort of republican or democratic Rome that never actually existed in the way it was intended in the 19th century, that backfired clamorously, especially during the French Revolution. In Parliament, however, Coccapillar's interventions were met with derision and laughter from colleagues, as predictably. He was just like a modern clown of some sort. And further proceedings against him, convictions followed, returning him to prison by July 1883. At the end of the legislature, he continued entering and exiting jail while publishing attacks through his newspaper. This tells you also how fairly liberal the Kingdom of Italy really was for this person just to be out there, being able to write this stuff. Then, of course, we were just talking about it yesterday that, free speech is, you can't think that defamation or other crimes go unpunished. You can speak and you should speak, but you also pay for it. You take your own responsibility for that. In other countries of Europe, this was not possible. Now, his popularity gradually waned, predictably, as these agitators, really these head of people really do, until he scored at least a major coup by denouncing irregularities that contributed to exposing the Roman bank scandal. This was a very important, big issue. It was a major political scandal rather than a strictly financial. Also, economically speaking, it was serious, but this was formally revealed in parliament by Napoleone Nicolayan in 1892, leading to Giolitti's fall. This is the early Giolitti's government that, as you know, lasted until World War One, and the end of his first government. In fact, at that point, cock-capillar Freemason, expelled from the Grande Oriente d'Italia. This was one of the lodges for his later defamatory campaign against the order itself, died in poverty in Rome in 1901 at nearly 70 after years of declining influence, repeated imprisonments, and a painful articular illness sustained only by a subsidy from the Real Casa, which was basically allowing him this role also in this picture, and this trajectory from Garibaldine fighter to populist tribune, scandal sheet journalist, and accidental catalyst in one of the major financial political crises of the Umbertine era, captured the underside of the Roman capital, the frustration of lesser people with aphorism, corruption, the gap between Risorgimento ideals and the realities of a new regime, mostly the fact that we're a band of sort of radicals, and that obviously they would have wanted less authority in order to be there to begin with, but that's not how a civilization proceeds. In any case, that this content that all the mechanisms that we've seen here, with the grand monuments and hygienic sort of distractions, etc., could never fully suppress nor resolve. And that, in any case, there is a need of a forte state, there is a need of the workers, there is a need of those that can simply be exploited in that function. And that, in any case, since ancient Rome, the plebeians always had that specific role within a higher, in fact, at the top, noble, mystical body. All right. So, the general video here, we can actually also finish it for today. But again, I'm glad to cover this because among all the various cities that we talked about and made videos on, Rome obviously is such an important one, and being acquainted a bit also with its more recent history, the broader political implications of the era, you understand how much you can draw out of this with some ease even. In any case, for today, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.